So there are some vocabulary words that don't all fit together, but I think they're words that most people do not know in the general population. They're not words that we speak a lot, but they are essential for you to learn as you move forward with Parkinson's disease, just so that you know what's happening when your physician tries to talk to you, when you're at lectures or meetings or reading online. I want you to have a good sense of what some of the vocabulary is that we throw around in Parkinson's disease. So first of all, the substantia nigra is this little pea-sized part of the brain that makes your dopamine. It is very small. As I said earlier, by the time you learn that you have Parkinson's, you've lost 50 to 70% of your dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra. So the nigra is called nigra. Nigra means black. And when we look on autopsy, when we dissect it, there's this thick black line that runs through the center of it, which is why it's called nigra. And so the nigra that is black because of all the melanin that is in there, the same melanin that makes up the color of your skin, which is one of the reasons people with Parkinson's tend to be a little more susceptible to melanoma too. And so the substantia nigra is actually what a lot of textbooks will start by saying Parkinson's disease is due to a deficiency of dopamine in the substantia nigra. The symptoms that lead to your diagnosis are certainly due to a dopamine deficiency in the substantia nigra, but they are not, that's not what Parkinson's is. The whole body has Parkinson's. We'll talk about this in a minute, but Parkinson's starts in the gut most likely and probably spreads up to the brain. Only when it has spread far enough and degenerated enough of that one nugget in your brain called the substantia nigra do you become symptomatic enough to, now you are so low in dopamine that you have trouble holding your hand still without a tremor. You are so low that it actually it is hard to stand up straight because you feel yourself being pulled forward. Your arm doesn't swing when you walk so naturally anymore. And so when you lose enough dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra is when you get the diagnosis, but I don't want you to think that that is what causes the disease and that is what the disease is all about. That's just kind of the point at which the disease progresses far enough to let you in that there's a problem, and that's where you start to get the diagnosis. So I've referred to this idea of protein aggregation. And so what tends to happen is in Parkinson's disease in particular, there's a protein in the body called alpha-synuclein. Alpha-synuclein is a naturally occurring protein. All humans make it. I'll talk about this in subsequent videos and later on, but we make it in response to intestinal inflammation. But people with Parkinson's make a lot of alpha-synuclein, and you make so much that it starts to misfold on top of itself. And as it misfolds, the body can't clear it normally, and it starts to kind of gunk up the cells. And there is a process by which our body finds these misfolded proteins and clears them. And we are working both in the natural product world and in the pharmaceutical world at strategies to enhance this process of clearing the misfolded proteins. Autophagy. Neuroplasticity is a word I think is going to come up. There's a author named Norman Doidge who has written a couple fabulous books, The Brain That Changes Itself. And for anybody who's interested in learning a little bit more about neuroplasticity, I can't recommend those books highly enough. They're empowering, they're insightful, they're scientifically sound. And what you really start to learn as you start to study how do you get adult neurons to sprout new branches is you realize that you have to push it. You have to leave your comfort zone. You have to do things that you wouldn't normally do. You have to hang out with people you wouldn't normally hang out with. You need to raise the level of expectation for yourself higher than what you would normally do on your own. That's why it's important to have piano teachers and coaches and physical therapists throwing you curveballs, holding you to a different standard than what you normally give to yourself. Maybe I should even start with what is dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that the body makes in response to enthusiasm and hope and pleasure And we knew that dopamine was the key molecule in the pleasure pathway long before we knew that it played a role in smooth motor function. And so it's fascinating because dopamine not only helps you feel excitement and enthusiasm and pleasure, it helps you move with fluidity. And so when you lose dopamine, what your friends and family start to notice is your arm not swinging, that your posture is not as upright as it should be, that you're starting to get a little bit of a tremor, especially when you get nervous. But what nobody on the outside sees is that you have probably for years, whether you realize it or not, often these changes are very insidious, that whether you realize it or not, over the last few years, you've been probably experiencing less pleasure. Things that used to get you excited, going golfing, playing, having lunch with friends, traveling, many people find that they're less motivated to take initiative, less motivated to plan travel, things like that. And it has to do with this lack of dopamine because, before you had a loss of dopamine, you'd see a pretty flower and a cute person walking by on the street and you get filled with these neurotransmitters that make you feel excited and enthusiastic. When you lose dopamine, you can see the same cute person or pretty flowers and it just doesn't have the same result. It just doesn't do much for you. Apathy is different than depression. I think that a lot of people, that is probably one of the hardest symptoms for people to navigate. We don't talk about it a lot because it's not as severe as depression. Everyone knows what depression is. Apathy is really just a lack of pleasure. Like I said, it's different than depression, but it's very difficult for relationships, for loved ones, because people with Parkinson's tend to become content doing less and less, and they're not bothered by it. You will rarely hear a person with Parkinson's say, I just don't feel like going out quite as much anymore, as a complaint. You will hear partners all the time say, I'm losing my spouse. They used to be motivated and ready to go do these things, and now they're just increasingly content to sit there and watch TV, do boring things around the house. And I want that vitalism back. I want some more vitality. That's the person I married. That's who I'm used to. And so it's neat because when you start the medications, the FDA approval for the meds is to improve motor function. But what a lot of people will say is their vitality comes back a little bit. When they bring the dopamine back on board, it's not just motor symptoms that improve. That dopamine is really instrumental for your quality of life. And these meds really do help you kind of get a sense of, oh, my old self is back. I didn't even realize that I wasn't getting the same pleasure from having people over for dinner or going out with friends. And it's not because I was depressed, it's just the things that used to bring me pleasure don't bring me pleasure quite so much anymore. That's apathy. Orthostatic hypotension is another one that I think everyone should learn the term early on. As Parkinson's disease progresses, what's supposed to happen is when you go from a seated or lying position to a standing position, your body responds by tightening your blood vessels so that you maintain a certain amount of blood pressure and you don't get dizzy when you stand up. In Parkinson's disease, that's one of the symptoms that people deal with is the blood vessels don't constrict quite the same way. And so when you stand up from tying your shoe or from seated or get up out of bed, people can get really dizzy. And so this is probably most relevant for people who are on high blood pressure medications. Over the first, few years, 5 years or so of the disease, people who used to have high blood pressure will find that they don't need to be on their medications anymore. And sometimes those medications actually can cause a whole different set of symptoms. So if you have high blood pressure, I just want you to know that what is expected with Parkinson's disease is that over time your blood pressure is likely to go down. First thing that will happen is you probably won't need your high blood pressure medications anymore, and then we have all kinds of strategies that we'll talk about in different videos for kind of helping you cope with these drops in blood pressure and how you can maintain blood pressure so you don't get dizzy when you stand up. The other vocabulary words that I want everyone to learn are dystonia and dyskinesia. And while this isn't always true, you can kind of think of these as opposite ends of the spectrum. Dystonia is an extreme form of muscle tightening. Most people experience it as curling toes when they wake up first thing in the morning, or their ankles maybe turning in a little bit, but think of it as a muscle cramp that is tightening so much that another person can actually see the contraction. So dystonia is a muscle cramp that is visible to another person. Dyskinesia is kind of the other end of the spectrum. People tend to get that one from, that's not a symptom of Parkinson's, it's a symptom of Parkinson medications overshooting the target. And so when you have a little bit too much dopamine, it just feels good to move. It's almost this writhing motion. And the type of dyskinesia that most people have is actually fairly low grade and tends to not be very bothersome. A lot of people don't want to start medications because they're afraid of the dyskinesia. We have an entire video on teaching you how to prevent getting dyskinesia. That is, in my opinion, a fairly easy goal to attain. But we'll talk about that separately. But those words, dyskinesia and dystonia, sound alike to people, and they're really kind of two opposite ends of the spectrum. Dyskinesia is from too much medication. Dystonia is often made better by medication. And one of the things that actually happens, I'll just tell you now, is as the disease progresses, it becomes harder to bounce between these two sets of symptoms. Early in the disease, it's like you're on a road where the distance between the curbs on either side is actually quite wide. There's a lot of wiggle room between what it takes for you to develop dyskinesia and the dystonia. And we don't fully understand why, but 20 years after you have this disease, sometimes it becomes a little more difficult to relieve your dystonia without developing dyskinesia. Right now, I just want you to know the difference between those two symptoms, and that one is a symptom of too much dopamine and the other is a symptom of not enough dopamine.